Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor Jon V. Kofas is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Hello everyone, welcome. July 18 of this year is the anniversary of the birth of Nelson Mandela, the first black president of South Africa in 1994, and a cult hero for South Africa, for the Pan-African movement, for all of Africa, for the global South, and many marginalized people throughout the world. Nelson Mandela is indeed a transcendent figure beyond politics, beyond history. He's one of those figures like Mahatma Gandhi in India who fought British colonialism and prevailed. In the case, by the way, Mahatma Gandhi got his start as a young lawyer in South Africa in the late 19th, early 20th century. So South Africa was the sort of a training ground for anti-colonialism for Mahatma Gandhi as well. Nelson Mandela was a product of the Cold War, of the decolonization movement. He was a product of the apartheid conditions in his native South Africa. The fact is that he has a legacy that most people throughout the world recognize as a fighter and a successful one against the apartheid state, and rightly so. And humanity, all of humanity, is better off that this man existed and that he accomplished the mission that he did against apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid, by the way, just for the purposes of definition, simply means the institutional racial segregation imposed by a political class on behalf of a socioeconomic elite deriving the benefits of exploiting the minority, or in some cases, in this case, especially in South Africa's case, the majority of the population by an elite minority, the capitalist class of South Africa, which also happened to be of white European descent, primarily Dutch and English, considering those were the two countries, England and Holland, that had divided South Africa into conquered and divided it into zones of influence, and they had taken over the assets of South Africa and reduced it from the 17th century onward, and reduced it into a country, reducing the population, 80 to 82% of the population of the country being black, reducing the people of the country that they essentially appropriated. Appropriation, by the way, is a euphemism for stealing. They appropriated the country, appropriated its wealth. It's no secret that South Africa is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and yet has one of the highest poverty levels in the world. Unfortunately, this was during the apartheid state, up until Nelson Mandela's release from prison, and until 1994, in 1990, and until 94 when he took over. However, racial capitalism, which is one of the themes for this analytical session on the legacy of the great Nelson Mandela, continued because of the compromise that the African National Congress, of which Mandela, of course, was a member and in charge, the compromise he arrived at between the time, even before, even while he was in prison, but especially after he was released from prison in 1990, up until the time he, of course, was duly elected, lawfully elected in 94, and during his regime and thereafter. Now, what is racial capitalism? Racial capitalism was a pillar in the in national capitalism in Africa, but all across Africa. Racial capitalism the theme of that is that racism, institutional racism, is an integral part of the capitalist system. That that indeed racism, institutionalized racism, as an integral part, serves to extract greater surplus value from labor. In other words, exploit them even more, get more out of that or out of them. This is true when you look at those who have studied the history of capitalism for the last 500 years. You know that in the 15th century, the Portuguese landing in Africa, and then many of the rest of the Europeans, and of course by the 17th and especially the 18th century, the transatlantic slave trade in the 18th century and the slave plantations throughout the Western Hemisphere, from the American colonies and then of course becoming the United States after independence, to all the way down to Brazil, the Caribbean, Brazil, that the slave-based economy as an integral part of capitalism helped to buttress the industrial capitalist economy of England and Northwest Europe. So there is a correlation between racial capitalism and the strengthening of the capitalist system and the evolution of mercantile capitalism to industrial capitalism, thanks to racial capitalism, thanks to the slave institution in the so-called New World, that is the Western Hemisphere. Now, racial capitalism, unfortunately, was at the core of the apartheid system in South Africa, whether with the Dutch or the English, but especially the Dutch, the Afrikaners, were insistent on and adamant and dogmatic about the exploitation of black labor, using institutionalized racism to justify it, and essentially reducing the population of South Africa from the 17th century to the end of apartheid to slave-like conditions, if you will, on their own land, exploiting the labor of these people and their own natural resources. Nelson Mandela, and the reason, and I am cautious about this because I am one of the millions, hundreds of millions of fans on this planet of this great man, of Nelson Mandela, who made a huge contribution to South Africa and to Africa in general, and of course the global South, and to humanity. Unfortunately, he compromised on the issue of racial capitalism, and that's what I want to focus on today. And the compromise came as follows. For roughly 4 years, 1990 to 94, what Nelson Mandela did, and the ANC and the current president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, who was in fact visiting the United States. He visited with Trump in late May, was the chief negotiator, one of the chief negotiators, and with the white establishment, and they had to compromise on black majority rule. They essentially traded black majority rule for racial capitalism. In other words, what would happen is that there would be a black majority government, and indeed there was and there is still. However, in other words, a top-down political revolution That's what we're talking about here. This is not a grassroots revolution. Although the uprising of Soweto, and I'll make some references to this later, in 1976, Soweto being the largest township in fact, the largest city in all of Africa, not even on the map of Africa, by the way, like Johannesburg and Cape Town, not even on the map because blacks lived there. Soweto had an uprising in 1976, and that uprising was the basis for a number of Africans in the elite, as well as corporations around the world and liberal Democrats arguing something must be done about apartheid in South Africa. One of the actually the richest family, not one of the richest family in South Africa was the English born family, but yeah, they had been in South Africa since the 19th century and took advantage of the Boer War from 1899 to 1902, this war between the Afrikaners, the Dutch farmers up in the Transvaal region, and the English down in Cape Town. And this was over licenses for gold mines and diamond mines up in the northern part. And the Oppenheimer family took advantage of that after that, and they established roots and became the family with the largest in the 20th century, with the largest mining operations in diamonds, gold, and platinum. In fact, many people may have heard of the Anglo-American Mining Company, huge company, as well as the De Beers Corporation, Oppenheimer family. During when Mandela was released from prison, Harry Oppenheimer, who developed a personal relationship with Nelson Mandela. Mandela, by the way, was a very charming individual. Many probably have seen videos of him, and I remember him when I was in higher education in the United States, and he would go on TV. He was even when he was in debates, he was in whether in the United States, Europe, or South Africa or England. It didn't matter where. He was charming even when he sharply disagreed. Harry Oppenheimer and the Oppenheimer family and the ANC did strike a deal, and it took some time, but the deal was that there would be no social revolution, no economic revolution, just a political revolution. That is black majority rule. Okay. Obviously, the ANC would govern as it does, with the right of the minorities to, meaning white, non-black majority, to have representation. They would have that. However, there would not be a social revolution. There would not be a change in the division of labor. There would not be a change in the economic status quo. This was the 1990s. This was when neoliberalism under the phase of globalization was very popular. And the question for the African National Congress and Nelson Mandela was, all right, who is going to manage the large operations in South Africa? The De Beers mine, the Anglo-American mining company. And so they, the fact is that they yielded on that issue. So the Mandela legacy is that in a large sense, racial capitalism would remain. Now, this is not how they framed it. And clearly, there would be a window for Keynesian policies, that is a social safety net to have the black majority, 80 to 82% of the population, by the way, being black, to have opportunities for upward social mobility. So let's make that very clear. However, the white minority, roughly 7% of the population, would not lose its privileged status in South Africa. So South Africa based on this deal of the early 1990s, would indeed remain the country deriving the benefits, the capitalist class of South Africa, deriving the benefits of exploiting, continuing to exploit the labor of the black majority, as well as operations they had in the rest of the African continent, by the way. And that linked, of course, to stock markets around the world, European and the United States, of course. So the socioeconomic status quo stays the same. That is part of the Nelson Mandela legacy as much as the anti-apartheid, the end of apartheid, is also part of the legacy. Now, there are roughly, I had to look this up, 3,000 books, a little bit more than 3,000 books published on Nelson Mandela and the ANC, and tens of thousands of articles, by the way. This is a topic, not as many as on the French Revolution that took place in 1789, which has over 15, 16,000, something like that, books published. But the fact is, to have this only took place 35 years ago. To have this kind of focus, scholarly attention, and journalistic attention on the end of apartheid in South Africa only 35 years ago is amazing, and it speaks to the monumental stature of Nelson Mandela, who became an icon and remains an icon throughout the global South. The vast majority of those books and articles are complementary. They are not critical. They focus on the accomplishments of Nelson Mandela. And if I may say so, this is something we do in higher education, in methods courses. If we in historiography and methods courses, they fall, all the literature, and I certainly haven't read all of it. I read some of the literature, but when you look at the literature on South Africa post Mandela, that is after he was released from prison, what you see is it falls into three categories. There is the category of the left, which obviously the African National Congress was linked to the Communist Party. Joe Slovo, a Lithuanian Jewish leader within the ANC, was a confidant of Nelson Mandela, and he wanted as much as possible an expanded social safety net, a much greater role of the state in the capitalist regime, that is state-owned enterprises, a reduced role, regimented role of the capitalist class of South Africa, which was predominantly white and had a long-standing history of racism and exploitation of the working class, which was predominantly black. So the Joe Slovo pushed that agenda, but there were others who pushed that agenda within the ANC. The ANC, including before he went to prison, Nelson Mandela had the label of communism, Marxism, if you will, and terrorism, by the way. Let me add that as well. The ANC and Nelson Mandela were in fact within the mold of a larger African movement in the 1950s and the 1960s. In 1962, by the way, Nelson Mandela went to prison on charges of terrorism, sabotage, and communism. Okay. Now, the literature that's on Nelson Mandela today is very complimentary, whether it comes from the left, although the left does point out the shortcomings with regard to racial capitalism, the Mandela legacy and racial capitalism. The liberal center, which is very complimentary because they look at the Nelson Mandela legacy and the African National Congress legacy from the perspective of identity politics. And then there's the right wing, the right wing, and then there is the far right wing, like Trump, of course, and others, not just Trump. But the fact is, there are those who argue there is reverse racism in South Africa that is against the white Afrikaners, and they're the real victims of this reverse racism. Although they're 7% of the population and they own 80% of the wealth in South Africa, while 80% of the population owns just under 6% of the wealth. So anyway, just a minor statistic on the reality on the ground. So the literature really tends to be complementary to Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress, with the exception of the far right, the hardcore Afrikaners and their supporters globally, the authoritarian neoliberals of today around the world, who have a revisionist version of what happened with Nelson Mandela. Now, when we look at the Nelson Mandela life and intertwined with African National Congress, it was, as I said before, it was an integral part of the struggle to end a form of colonialism in the form of apartheid. Mandela and the African National Congress leadership of the 1950s and 1960s came out of the early Cold War, when there was division between East and West, communism and capitalism. Now, some people have difficulty grasping the simple fact that it would be very difficult for an African liberation leader, an African liberation movement, to be pro-West capitalist, considering they had a legacy, 400-year legacy of exploiting African slaves and exploiting African labor. And even when African slavery ended, the transatlantic slave trade, England passed, the Parliament passed a law in the early 19th century, and then gradually other countries started passing laws as well. And even when slavery ended in Brazil and in the US and the Caribbean, even then, the fact is, post-colonial race, institutionalized racist conditions, in other words, racial capitalism, continued. So although slavery was finished, the free worker was exploited owing to the color of the skin and origin that is African origin. So this is a reality. Now, how can someone not look to the other side and see what they have to offer, namely the communist model, which, at least in theory, this is not to say that in reality, but in theory, they promised egalitarianism, sharing of assets, the state providing the vehicle for social justice. The vehicle for social justice did not, the state was not a vehicle for social justice in the capitalist West. It was a vehicle for capital accumulation. It was a vehicle to accumulate capital for the privileged elites, which had a legacy. I reiterate this point because this is how the African National Congress leadership saw it, including Nelson Mandela. They were in the business of exploiting black labor. Okay. Now, the Mandela came out of a tradition, and I'm going to put him in context of other African leaders. Kwame Nkrumah, one of the heroes of the African decolonization movement and Pan-Africanism, by the way, and the non-aligned movement in the 1950s and 1960s, Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana influenced the African National Congress and Nelson Mandela. He too was influenced by Marxism and the concept of egalitarianism and ending exploitation, but above all, using the state as a vehicle of social justice, not to redistribute income from the bottom, from the workers to the privileged capitalist class. This is very important because this debate, by the way, remains true to this day across the world. Whether the state, what is the role of the state? To redistribute wealth from the middle class and especially the working class. And in this case, by the way, racial capitalism from the working class, which happens to be black, to the white privileged capitalist class? Or is the role of the state an arbiter to in society to carry out as a vehicle of social justice and to carry out programs, policies that promote social justice? That is an important aspect of what the role of the state is here. Kwame Nkrumah, a leader of the non-aligned, a leader in the Pan-African movement, like I said, Mandela influenced the African National Congress. Another very important leader was from the Congo, Patrice Lumumba. Patrice Lumumba was also left-leaning. That is, in interviews, he denied that he was a communist. He would deny he was pro-Soviet. By that, he meant pro-Soviet, by the way. But the fact is, he was left-leaning. He also believed in a strong state structure that would resist post-colonial exploitation by the comprador bourgeoisie. The comprador bourgeoisie means the local capitalist class in the Congo in this case, but given, in every country in Africa, there was a local capitalist class, which collaborated with the international capitalists to exploit local labor. Lumumba was on the hit list of the CIA. They tried to have him assassinated. He was ultimately killed, but it isn't certain who actually, not who killed him, but whether the CIA was involved. Lumumba, also a major figure, a heroic figure in the African liberation movements of the 1950s and 1960s. Like I said, he was killed in 1961. Actually, he influenced the African National Congress and Nelson Mandela, who a year after Lumumba was assassinated, Mandela went to prison. The Afrikaner regime sent him to prison as a terrorist and a communist and a saboteur. Another important figure in the African liberation movements that also was in the same vein as the African National Congress was that of Tanzania under Julius Nyerere. He too was an advocate of socialism and decolonization. Now, Nyerere actually provides for me an interesting segue, because he did not see how you can proceed with decolonization. He did not see how you cannot have socialism as part of the decolonization, considering that the indigenous population, in this case Tanzania, formerly known as Tanganyika, by the way, considering that this is the exploited population, they had nothing, that they could only be empowered through socialist policies. The last, and there are a lot of others. I'm going to mention Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, who was more like Nyerere, and he also influenced Mandela. He too was part of that Pan-African, non-aligned, influenced by left-wing politics. So the fact is that Mandela came out of that tradition. And of course, he had next to him, he actually met him in college and they became partners and lifelong friends. He had Oliver Tambo, who was a law student with Mandela and influenced him. They had a law firm that worked mainly on issues of uh, racial discrimination, apartheid. And Oliver Tambo was also left leaning, but even more so, another very important confidant, Joe Slovo, the Lithuanian Jewish individual who was advising Mandela to consider social revolution not just a political revolution, not just a bourgeois revolution, top down, get the government, but then continue to use the state not as a vehicle for social justice, but as a vehicle for income redistribution to the exact same white elites as before apartheid. This is a very important point. Slovo was, in fact, very pro-labor. He was Jewish, he came from Lithuania. Um, Discrimination, obviously, because he was Jewish, but also very much steeped in Marxist ideology in terms of looking at the issue of revolution, not just in terms of race, but transcending race, class. Class struggle to Joe Slovo transcended the racial struggle. Mandela did not. Mandela actually, in theory, accepted all of this, but in the course of his road to the presidency up to 1994, 1990 to 94, in his negotiations, of course, with Ramaphosa at the head of the negotiations, he went along with the compromise that there will be black majority rule, but the state will not become a vehicle for social justice. There will be a modicum of social justice, gradual baby steps, but no social revolution. And so the division of labor would essentially stay the same. And this is part of the legacy uh, of the Mandela era. Now, there was enormous pressure. Some of the books I mentioned, there are over 3,000 books, tens of thousands of articles. Some of the books and articles point out that actually it wasn't just the Oppenheimer family and some of the rich families, the wealthy families, the capitalist class in Johannesburg and Cape Town. It was also Wall Street, American politicians representing Wall Street, um, namely the Clinton administration, which was a lot of people don't associate the Clinton administration if they haven't studied, of course, this issue with neoliberalism. But it wasn't Reagan, just Reagan, who was who introduced institutionalized neoliberalism, although the roots go back to the late 70s. Clinton continued and was as neoliberal as Reagan. It's just that his style was different. Identity politics, cultural issues were different. But the economics of neoliberalism, from Reagan to George W. Bush, to George Herbert Walker Bush, I'm sorry, to Bush the elder, in other words, the father, to Clinton, that neoliberalism continues. And it was the Clinton administration that was pressuring Nelson Mandela. And it did so through the World Bank and the IMF. And just, I believe it was a year before, 1993, a year before Mandela became president of South Africa, the International Monetary Fund provided a monetary stabilization loan. Wonderful, except for one thing, that is the International Monetary Fund, in providing monetary stabilization loans, sets conditions. It's called conditionality. And those conditions are to adhere to a neoliberal agenda, privatization of public assets, lower taxes for the wealthy and corporations, regimenting the working class, cutting social programs, deregulation, free flow of capital from other countries, coming in from other countries, and facilitating such capital. There was that kind of pressure. Now, the IMF did make that loan. And what it said to the public at the time is that the loan was to help. The IMF was now in the business of humanitarianism, was to help with the transition of South Africa to democracy, when in fact it was to help Africa cement its roots in neoliberal policies, privatization, deregulation, corporate subsidies, a social, from a transition, making sure that South Africa, once Mandela was in office the following year, would not transition to a social welfare state, to a Keynesian state, as existed during the New Deal era, the FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, but rather to a corporate welfare state, so that the South African white elite, primarily white elite, would retain its privileged position, and of course international capitalists would continue to benefit from South Africa's cheap labor and raw materials. That is also part of the Nelson Mandela legacy. Now, did Mandela have a choice? Mobilize the 80% of the population and have a social revolution. The question is, what price would be paid? Right? There's that to be said. What price would be paid? The fact is, he did not go that route. He went the route of political reformism, that is, having the state under black majority rule, symbolic, that was very significant, not just to South Africans who revered him as a hero, as a saint, if you will, revered him as the liberator of their country, but also a hero and an icon for all of Africa and for much of the global South, and many in the rest of the planet, by the way. So the force of his cult of the cult of personality of Nelson Mandela permitted him to continue with racial capitalism. And as long as the black majority was in charge, they could say, well, we have the organs of the state in our hands. However, the question is, under what criteria do we judge the Mandela legacy? We must judge the Mandela legacy under the criteria of ending apartheid, of securing black majority rule, but also of living standards for blacks, for the 82% of the population and the working class in general. It is true, by the way, that there was some social mobility. Even Ramaphosa, who started out, Cyril Ramaphosa, the current president of South Africa, is one of the millionaires. His wife is a millionaire as well. So there are black families that did become, in the last 35 years, that have become wealthy. They are a symbolic few. So there was a cooptation of some black families into the capitalist class, including some from the political class, like I mentioned, like Ramaphosa family, for example. Okay, that's true. That is not a substitute for social mobility on a mass scale, as uh, Joe Slovo, who represented the left wing of the ANC, the Lithuanian Jewish man who was a confidant of Nelson Mandela, was advising him back when they were trying to decide which way they were going to go, whether they were going to embrace the ideology of black nationalism or the ideology of class struggle. If it was going to be black nationalism, then that meant they would have to compromise on a very important issue as far as Joe Slovo and many of the on the lefts were concerned, and that is the issue of having to continue with class warfare that the white elite would continue, not through racism, but just through the neoliberal political economy that, regardless of whether it's in South Africa or in France, in England, in the United States, it doesn't matter where in Argentina, it doesn't matter where it is, there is class warfare. The enemy of the capitalist class under the neoliberal ideology is the working class. And the idea is to have the state redistribute as much income through the fiscal system, not to mention corporate subsidies, by the way, and bailouts and subsidized loans, okay? Not to mention any of the corporate welfare package under neoliberalism, deregulation, which allows them to do whatever they like without the state regulating them, watching them, regulating the free marketplace. And so South Africa made its choice. This is the choice that they made. The question is, of course, what are the positives, what are the negatives? Through the Reconstruction Development Program that the African National Congress introduced, it is true that there were three goals, and I must mention this is part of the compromise also: health, education, and housing. Three issues which are as much of importance to South Africa as they are to Kenya, as they are to the United States, for that matter. Health, education, housing. The Reconstruction Development Program was going to improve living standards for the 82% of the black population, mostly working class, most of them living in shacks in townships, by the way. I mentioned Soweto Township. It's interesting that Soweto was the largest city in South Africa. And when you looked at a map, it didn't appear anywhere on the map. It's as though it didn't exist. And even today, in conducting internet searches, when you write in largest cities in South Africa, Soweto may not even come up. Johannesburg, Durban, Cape Town, those cities come up, not Soweto. You have 82% of the population. Where do they live? In slums. And what happens to these people in these slums? Were they helped by the Reconstruction Development Program? There was some improvement in health, some improvement in housing, some improvement in education. But the spirit of Soweto of 1976, when students and workers rose up against the apartheid regime and the police, the white government sent the police and they killed a lot of black demonstrators. That spirit, that revolutionary spirit of South Africa was not present in this program. The reforms were very modest. There was this is not to say there was no progress. There was some progress. But considering the population almost doubled from 1990 to today, 35 years later, there weren't enough housing units. There were hardly enough clinics and hospitals. The best hospitals, the best clinics, the best housing, best schools were and remain in the privileged white communities and accessible to blacks who can pay. So there was very little progress. Now, what is the result of all this? It's not only that Africa has 56% poverty rate in 2024 and 33% unemployment and over 50% youth unemployment. That's not the only thing. It has one of the worst crime rates in the world. And one of the reasons that the neo-fascists and far-right wingers around the world are crying out that there is reverse racism because blacks are attacking whites and stealing and killing in some cases is because of the rise of organized crime and crime in general in a lot of these townships. A lot of these young people have nothing to do. They resort to everything from drug trade to gun trade to human trafficking. So there is a huge rise in crimes. This is what happens when you do not solve in a society. It's not just this society, any society. When a society doesn't solve the issues pertaining to social justice, giving people a job so they can survive, educating them, providing healthcare to them, just basics, housing, when a society doesn't provide that, and it keeps them in squalor, keeps them in slums, crime is inevitable. They're going to return to crime. And the crime victims in South Africa, by the way, contrary to the far right wing around the world, including in the United States, that it's targeted, somehow whites are targeted, the victims are mostly black. The victims are not mostly white. If they're white, it happens to be crime of because they're there to steal. They're there because there are no opportunities for employment. They have a third of the population out of work, and among youth, more than half the population out of work. Okay, now when even the modest proposal of Ramaphosa, and it started before him, of trying to get some land, acquire some land that whites who own most of the land, and only 7% of the population, by the way, some 70% of the land they own, 7% of the population. Even the modest proposal of taking land that they don't use and compensating them for it. This is not land expropriated without compensation. Expropriated land with compensation. Even that proposal, and giving it to blacks so they can cultivate it, so they can live instead of resorting to crime, an anathema to the white Western world's conservatives and far-right wingers. They regard that as reverse racism. Okay, then they complain that there is South Africa has blacks are engaged in crime. What else would they be engaged in? When you look at the first scientific study about crime and the criminal justice system in 17th and 18th century Europe, the first scientific studies that were conducted, what you have is the connection between crime and environmental conditions. Environmental conditions generate criminal behavior on the part of people. Now, it's true, some people are just born with the seed of criminal disposition, okay? But the vast majority, this is what is due to the environment, to environmental conditions, to the social conditions. That is, the social contract creates these conditions. And unless the social contract addresses them, and this is where Nelson Mandela's legacy is indeed fall short, it falls short. It's just as simple as that. Unless those are addressed, and they were not addressed under Mandela, they were not addressed under subsequent presidents all the way to today's Ramaphosa. They are not addressed. Now, he obviously has said that he wants to address them. Although the ANC of today has it distanced itself a long time ago from the left wing, and it renounced the left wing, and it's a mainstream status quo political party. It's not interested in social revolution. It's not interested in rocking the neoliberal boat, not at all. It's interested in maintaining the social and economic status quo. Now, let me turn to foreign policy because I see I only, I don't want to go over an hour. The Nelson Mandela legacy in foreign policy is where there is, I would say, more success than is in domestic policy. Historically, not just Nelson Mandela, but Kwame Nkrumah, Lumumba, Nyerere, others were, in fact, pro non-aligned, and historically, African liberation movements were non-aligned. Nelson Mandela was a major figure in promoting South Africa's links to the global South, and had no apologies to make about supporting the Palestinian people. It's unfortunate, by the way, that to this day, there is this question, do you believe, and unfortunately it's even asked of people who are very highly ethical people, like Francesca Albanese of the United Nations, the rapporteur for Palestine. They asked the question, does Israel have the right to exist? Which is really asking, does the apartheid state have the right to exist? It's such a question would have never been asked when Mandela was around. In other words, it would have implied, so you want to go back to the apartheid state, because that's exactly what is asked. Do you want apartheid? You mean you don't support the apartheid state? And of course, the Mandela was pro-Palestinian, by the way. And to its credit, the African National Congress remained pro-Palestinian, and Ramaphosa took the leadership in bringing charges against Israel in the World Court, in the ICC, against Israel on the issue of genocide in Gaza. So we have a continued policy of non-aligned. South Africa, by the way, is heavily linked to China and Russia through the BRICS group. That is the BRICS, it stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. It is part of that bloc. South Africa has remained loyal to that group, which many in the Western world analysts regard as anti-US and anti-Western, and in some respects it is. In some respects, they look at the G7 and the West as the declining bloc, and that the future is with Asia. Now, part of the Mandela African National Congress legacy is that South Africa has remained a leader in the global South for advocating for marginalized people, and tilted very heavily toward the global south. And like I said, through BRICS, it proves it through its actions toward China and Russia. And one of the reasons for this, by the way, is because the future of South Africa really, although Ramaphosa did his best when he came here in late May to forge some kind of ties to talk about tariffs that President Trump has been imposing all over the world, and cultivate trade relations and so forth, greater trade relations. Because South Africa is not just about diamonds and gold and platinum. It's about wine, it's the other products in South Africa. Anyway, the fact is that the future of South Africa rests much more with China, which is the world's ascending economic power, and less and less with the West. The Europeans and the United States recognize this. I don't think they're that blind, even though they may want to revive an interest in South Africa. I think the future is there. Now, one last word I want to say about Mandela. Like I said at the outset, I am one of the many millions, hundreds of millions of fans of Nelson Mandela. And I do believe, like many do, that he is at that level, he's of that stature like Mahatma Gandhi and Kwame Nkrumah. In my view, I regard Kwame Nkrumah as a great African leader, and Patrice Lumumba. I think that he, according to some, he's even even greater stature than that. However, there is a however. The living standards and the material conditions of a society, of all the people in that society, those are the ultimate criteria of how we judge the legacy of a state leader and a political party that is at the head of government. While this man does deserve praise, and this year, by the way, 2025, is dedicated to his memory, to fight poverty and inequality. Just the fact that this year is dedicated to the Nelson Mandela memory of combating inequality and poverty itself tells you a lot. It tells you that we still have a long way to go. In some respects, not much progress has been made in South Africa itself. And it's not just South Africa, by the way, but the entire continent of Africa, although there are layers, and South Africa is complex, and South Africa, I'm sorry, the continent of Africa is complex. Sub-Saharan Africa, if we divide from Islamic Africa up in the north, it's not as easy. However, I'm a subscriber in my publications. I embrace the dependency theory and the modern world system theory, that indeed the African continent is part of the world capitalist periphery and remains dependent. It has not broken the dependency relationship to the core of the capitalist world economy. Yes, the core is shifting toward East Asia, toward China, especially very rapidly. That's true. And South Africa is part of the BRICS group. But overall, the continent of Africa, and South Africa in particularly, are in that matrix of the capitalist world economy, where the majority of the labor in South Africa is exploited, because racial capitalism was never erased. Apartheid was, but not racial capitalism. I want to thank you for tuning in. Please write comments, ask questions, and join this channel. Thank you very much.